This is part 145 of ASP.NET tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss implementing autocomplete text box in an ASP.NET Web Forms application using jQuery autocomplete widget and a web service. We'll be using this table TBL students within this demo. Here is the SQL script to create this table and populate it with some sample data. I'll have the script available on my blog in case if you need it. We want our web form to look like this when it is rendered. We basically want to retrieve all the students that are present within this table TBL students and then display them within the grid view control, as you can see here. We also want to provide a search interface. For example, if I type letter M within the search text box, we want to list all the student names that start with letter M. And then if we select a student name, and then once we click the search button, we want that selected student to be displayed within the grid view control. So let's see how to achieve this using jQuery autocomplete widget and a web service. First, let's set up our application to use jQuery autocomplete widget, and to do that, navigate to jQueryui.web.com, click download link. So this should list all the jQuery UI widgets. By default, all of the widgets are selected. Click this checkbox to deselect, and then we are interested in autocomplete widget, so let's select that. And notice that all the dependencies are also automatically selected. And now scroll all the way to the bottom, click this download button. The required jQuery files and the CSS files will be downloaded. They will be downloaded in a zip format. We need to extract them, so I have already extracted them. And then once you navigate to the folder, you should see folder structure like this. We are interested in these two folders, JS and CSS folders. Within the JS folder, we have the required jQuery files. So we are interested in this jQuery file and the minified jQuery UI file. So let's copy these two and move them to the scripts folder. So let's paste them there. And we also need the CSS files. So let's go back to this jQuery folder, and then let's expand open CSS folder within that UI lightness, and we are interested in images and this minified custom CSS. So let's copy them and move them to the styles folder. Okay, at this point we have set up our application to use jQuery autocomplete widget. The next step is to write a web service. So this web service is going to be responsible for retrieving the matching student names. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a web service. So right click on the project name within the Solution Explorer, add a new item, and we want to add a web service, and let's call this student service. Click add. So this should add a web service, and we are going to write some ADO.NET code. So let's go ahead and import the required namespaces. So we need system.data, we need system.data.sql client, and we need system.configuration. And we want this web service to be callable from JavaScript. And if that is the case, we need to uncomment this line. So let me uncomment this. And look at this. So if you want your service to be callable from JavaScript, then you need to decorate that with the script service attribute. Okay. Now this method is going to return matching student names. Okay. So I'm going to call this method get student names. And what are we going to return? Student names, list of matching student names. So basically the return type is going to be list of strings. Alright, so now let's write the ADO.NET code to retrieve matching student names. But before we do that, we need a stored procedure. And then for example, you type letter M, what should happen? All the student names that match that start with letter M should be retrieved. So we're going to have a stored procedure which is going to have one parameter, and that parameter is going to contain the letters that we have typed here, and that stored procedure is going to return us the matching names. So let's go ahead and implement that stored procedure. So create procedure, let's call it sp get matching student names, and let's call the parameter at student name. This is going to be of type envarchar as begin end, and within the body we want to select just the name of the student from TBL students table, where name like whatever we are passing into the stored procedure as a parameter, and we need to append the wildcard percentage symbol because we are using like here. Okay, so let's go ahead and create the stored procedure F5, and let's quickly test this to make sure it works as expected. So for example, if I pass letter M, let's see if this works. So press F5, look at that, I get the employees whose names start with letter M. Alright, so let's go ahead and implement our web service here. So first of all, we need to retrieve the connection string from a web.config file. And if you look at the web.config file here, I have already a connection string with name dbcs, which is pointing to local installation of SQL Server, and we are using Windows authentication. Okay, alright, so let's go ahead and read the connection string, and to do that we're going to make use of configuration manager class dot connection strings of what is the name of a connection string, dbcs, and retrieve the connection string with that name. And let's use a using statement and then create a SQL connection object. The advantage of using block here is that we don't have to explicitly call a close method on the connection object. It'll be automatically closed for us. So SQL connection equals new SQL connection, and we want to create a SQL connection object using the connection string that we have just retrieved from web.config file. The next step is to create the SQL command object. So SQL command cmd equals to new SQL command, and our SQL command is actually a stored procedure. So this is the name of the stored procedure. So let's copy that and move it right here. And the next parameter is the connection object. So on using which connection object do you want to execute the stored procedure? This connection object. We're going to pass that as the second parameter. And since the command object is executing a stored procedure, we need to tell that to the command object using command type property. And this stored procedure expects a parameter, and what's the name of the parameter? At student name. So we need to associate that parameter with the stored procedure. So let's create a parameter object. So SQL parameter, let's call it parameter equals new SQL parameter, and we're going to use this overloaded version of the constructor where it expects the name of the parameter and the value. Okay, so what's the name of the parameter? At student name. So let's pass that there. And where are we going to get the value from? The value for this parameter is going to come into this function as a parameter. So let's call this string student name. So let's pass that as the value for this SQL parameter. And the next step is to associate this parameter object with this command object. And to do that, we are going to use parameters property of the command object and pass our SQL parameter object to this function. Okay, and all that is left out now is to open the connection and execute the command. So SQL data reader rdr equals command dot execute reader. So what are we going to get back? We're going to get list of students back. So we need to return list of those student names back. Okay, so first of all, let's go ahead and create a list of string, and let's call it student names equals new list of string. And to this list, let's add the name of the student. So we need to loop through the result set, and to do that we're going to make use of while loop. So loop through the SQL data reader, and while you are reading, from the reader retrieve name, convert that to string, and then add that to the list. So student names dot add. So once we are done looping through and adding the students to this list, what we need to do? We need to return that student list back. So return student names. So we have just implemented our student service, and let's quickly check if it works as expected. So let me run this by pressing Ctrl F5. So this student service should have one method, get student names. So once we click that, it expects a parameter. Let's say for example I pass letter J as the parameter, invoke, and notice that we get 2 students whose name start with letter J. Okay, so our web service is working as expected. The next step is to invoke this web service from our webform1.aspx. First of all, we need to design our web form like this. Okay, so we need this word name and then a text box and then a button control and then a grid view control. So let's go on and design our web form. So name, we need a text box control. So let's go to toolbox and let's drag and drop a text box control, and let's give it a meaningful name. Let's call it txt student name. And we need a button control. So let's drag and drop a button control, and let's give this a name. Let's call it btn, an ID. Let's call it btn submit, and the text on the button to submit. Okay, and then let's include a grid view control. Let's include an HTML break and then a grid view control. Grid view control should be under data tab. So let's expand that, drag and drop a grid view control, and let's give this grid view control a meaningful ID. Let's call this gv students. Okay, so now we need to write some JavaScript here. So if we run this now, we should have the interface that we see here, a text box, button, and a grid view control. Okay, there we go. So now we need to write some JavaScript basically to implement autocomplete feature. Okay, so we need the script and CSS files. So we need this CSS file, jQuery custom CSS file. So let's drag and drop that there, and we also need these jQuery files. So let's drag and drop them in that order. Okay, so we're going to write some JavaScript here. So let's use script tag, set the type to text/JavaScript, and the language is going to be JavaScript. Okay, so let's write some jQuery code here. So dollar function. Okay, so we want to implement autocomplete for this text box control, right? So we need to first find the text box control, and to find the text box we're going to make use of ID selector. So dollar ID selector in jQuery is pound, and then to get the client ID of this text box control, I'm going to use client ID property, and to use that I'm going to use angle brackets percentage equals, that's the name of the control. I'm going to use client ID property to get the client ID basically. Okay, so for this text box we want to implement autocomplete feature. So we are going to invoke this autocomplete function, but this function expects several options, and the most important option is the source option. The source option is going to tell what data it has to display. Okay, so basically where are we going to retrieve the source data from? We're going to retrieve that using this web service. So this web service has got this method which is going to return us the matching names. Okay, so the source for this autocomplete feature is going to be that web service. Okay, so and we are going to invoke that using Ajax. And to speed things up, I have already typed that code, so let me copy that and paste it here, and it's straightforward code. We'll go over that in just a bit. So here we are specifying the source option for this autocomplete feature, and basically the source is going to be a function which has 2 parameters, request and response, and we are going to invoke the get student names method within student service.asmx web service using Ajax. Okay, so this is the URL of this web service that we need to invoke, get student service.asmx /get student names. So let's actually make sure we don't have any errors in the name. So the name of the method is get student names, and the web service is going to be student service.asmx. So let's paste that there. Okay, and if you look at this get student names method, it expects a parameter. So obviously we need to supply a value for that parameter. So where are we going to get the value for that parameter from? So we need to specify that. We're going to get that from the request object. So this request object has got this term property. From that term property we are going to retrieve that. Okay, so we are going to pass that as a value for this parameter. So what's the name of the parameter here? Student name. So the second line here is the parameter value. Okay, and we're going to invoke this get student names function using post request, and the data type has to be JSON and the content type has to be JSON. And then obviously when we execute this function, there could be two things happening. Either it has successfully executed and returned the JSON result, otherwise there could be an error. Okay, so if JSON data is successfully returned, then what do you want to do with that JSON data? So this is the JavaScript function that I want to execute in case if the JSON data is successfully returned. Okay, so what are we doing here? We're basically retrieving the data and passing it to the response. Okay, so basically here the confusing thing is, why are we using this .d? Now one thing to keep in mind is that ASP.NET Ajax library uses a wrapper around JSON formatted data to prevent JSON hijacking. If this is too confusing at the moment, don't worry, we're going to discuss JSON hijacking in a later video session in great detail. For now, understand that to retrieve data from JSON formatted data we use .d. Okay, now to this object you can give any meaningful name you want. For example, you can call it result. So within this result object, to retrieve the JSON data you have to use .d, and that is to prevent JSON hijacking. That's how a wrapper around JSON formatted data is implemented within ASP.NET Ajax, which we will discuss in detail in a later video session. Alright, so if there is any error executing that function, then we are going to just alert this message there is a problem processing your request. Okay, so at this point everything should be working as expected. So let's go ahead and run this. If we have implemented everything, then autocomplete should work. So for example, when I type letter M, look at that, I get the matching student names. So if I press letter J, we get the matching student names. Now when I select the student, click submit, nothing happens. We need to implement that search code. So that is again straightforward. So within your web form, so within the page load event, we're going to write some ADO.NET code. So let me actually copy these namespaces and paste them within the web form. Okay, let's also copy this ADO.NET code so that we don't have to keep typing it. So here I'm going to have a private function void, let's call it get student data, and obviously this is going to have a parameter string name, maybe let's call it student name. So when we select a student name and then click submit, we only want to display the matching student name student within the grid view control. Okay, now another thing is when we first load this web form, we want to display all the students within the grid view control. So for that to happen, so this student name could be null at that point. So when the web form first loads, the student name could be null. Okay, in which case we want to load all the employees, all the students basically. So first of all, let's create a stored procedure to get all the students. So create a procedure, let's call it sp get students. Again, this is going to have a parameter at student name, so let's pass that, and this parameter can be null. So I'm making this optional by specifying a default value as begin end. So what I'm going to do is copy this and paste it within this procedure. So we not only want the name, we want all the columns. So I'm going to say star from TBL students, where name like whatever we have within this parameter or that name, I mean at student name parameter could be null, in which case we're going to retrieve all the students. So let's create the stored procedure. Look at that. If I just execute that without passing any value for the parameter, I get all the students. In case if I pass, for example, letter J, then I get only that students whose name start with letter J. Alright, so let's go ahead and invoke the stored procedure. So basically what are we doing here? We're reading the connection string from web.config file. We want to create a list of students, or we don't even need a list because we are going to bind the output directly to the grid view control. So we have the connection string, we are creating the SQL connection object. The command is actually this stored procedure sp get students. So we're going to pass that here, and we're going to execute this command using this connection object. The command type is stored procedure, and this stored procedure expects a parameter, and the name of the parameter is student name, and we are going to get the value for that parameter using this method parameter. Okay, but then one thing to keep in mind is that this parameter can be null. Okay, so if that is the case, we first need to check if string dot is null or empty. So if this parameter is not null or empty, then create a parameter object, associate a value with that, and then add it to the command object. Okay, and then open the connection, execute the command. We don't even need this while loop, so let's get rid of that. What we're going to do here is, what is the name of our grid view control? GV students. The data source for this is going to be the reader object, and we are going to invoke data bind. Alright, so we have the private function. So when the page first loads, if it's not a post back, then we want to invoke this get student data function, and then we are going to pass null for the student name, because when the web form first loads, we want to display all the students within the grid view control. In that case, student name is going to be null. Okay, now we have a button control on the web form. So when we click that button control, we want to display the matching students. Okay, so in that case, we are going to call again this get student data function, but then we are going to pass the student name. So where are we going to get the student name from? Txt student name text box. So dot text property should give us that. Alright, that's it. So let's go ahead and run this now. When the page first loads, we will get all the students displayed within the grid view control. And look at this, the moment I type letter J, we have autocomplete. I select a student, student is displayed. I type M, I get autocomplete. If I just submit, look at that, I get all the students whose name starts with letter M. Alright, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.